differ with that statement, but we'll get right into it. Okay, and I'm going to start with a softball, and we'll go from there. But we'll start with Bob, and we'll go down the row. I wonder if you guys could just take about 90 seconds to talk a little bit about how the organizations that you work for or are part of are involved in open source and the kinds of things that you're doing with it. So, Bob?
Okay, thanks. Am I on? I'm Bob Sutor. I work for IBM, specifically the software group. We've been involved with open source, well, I think officially since the late 1990s, but actually early on in the mainframe era, we used to give source code away. That was just the way people did things way back in the 60s and 70s. My work today in the software group, of course, focuses on the software we build, but software runs on hardware. It's part of services as well. I've been a big part of, generally speaking, what we do with open source software in the context. But lately, my focus is really on what I would call growth initiatives around Linux and software. So that is, from a business perspective, what new projects should we be involved with and with whom, right, to drive the growth of Linux, but also drive the growth of our software business.
Yep, my turn. I'm Jim Jagielski. My day job is as an engineer with Red Hat. But as far as open source is concerned, I think most people know me as one of the co-founders of the Apache Software Foundation, which actually has a history long before it was actually the foundation. It was just a ragtag group of people called the Apache Group who developed the Apache web server. And of course, since then, we've incorporated, we've grown from 2 projects to over 70. The ASF is basically an open source nonprofit organization designed to be sort of like an umbrella organization for a number of open source projects. We provide the infrastructure, the legal requirements, things like that to help open source projects grow and scale. Part of my keynote tomorrow will be about how the ASF hopefully does that, helps these projects and communities grow and things like that. In addition to my work at the Apache Software Foundation, which I'm currently serving as president, I'm also a director for Outer Curve and OSI. I was just elected to OSI actually last week or so. And that's it.
My turn. Can you hear that? My name's Iain Sanderson. I'm the Chief Medical Information Officer of Health Sciences South Carolina, based here in Columbia, but also with a growing informatics and development group in Charleston, South Carolina. I was brought here to start a group to really bring the specialty of biomedical informatics and to start some statewide projects for research information systems, things like a data warehouse between the main hospitals in South Carolina for the purposes of translational research and also for the clinical systems. My role within open source is that when I started to do this, I was faced with a choice: buy a bunch of vended systems or get involved with open source systems to do the same things. We have a portfolio now of open source systems and a group of developers who are becoming adept at implementing them and hopefully now beginning to contribute. We have, having been a consumer of these systems, we're now beginning to become actual contributors. We have a research permissions management system for the state of South Carolina. We're going to be making an open source project that is novel across the US. So it's an evolution of a program. The people involved are now becoming to be contributors with regarding to that. And we'll be talking about that in the healthcare track later on today.
I'm Bryant Patten, and in the open source field I wear a couple of hats. I've been in educational software for several decades, and I have a nonprofit, the National Center for Open Source in Education, which is, our focus is to bring open source solutions to K-12 schools, and I also have a for-profit consulting company to help those schools implement that.
Thanks. Part of being the moderator is I get to ask the questions that I care about, so I'm going to start by asking one. And you saw in my presentation a little bit about this idea of open source as something that drives cultural change in an organization as well. And I'd actually like to start with Iain, because we had a discussion over beer last night, which I thought was really good, and then go back to Bob, and then open it up more generally about some of the cultural changes that you've seen in your development shops over time as you've been adopting open source, and whether you think I'm just smoking something or whether it's something that you see as well.
Sure. My background is I come from clinical systems. I was the associate CIO at Duke Medical Center, where the norm then in the mid-90s was to buy a big chunk of software and configure and implement it, pay a lot of money to a vendor, and try to make it work and work in the best possible way for your end users. And of course, the main development effort associated with that was the implementation and operate mode. What we found, though, was that we could get an awful lot more out of the systems if we put wrappers around it. And the advent of the web, and I'll be talking about that in the healthcare track, was to use a web wrapper around the vended systems that we'd actually created, and that gave it opened the door to functionality that we could add to around the vended system. And in order to make that happen, I needed a group of developers who were adept at the sort of things like struts and Apache and Java server pages and all of that that weren't possibly there within the vended community. In order to make that work, I had to attract the type of developers who could work in that environment and create the agile development effort, agile development environment to have that. I've seen that come through at Duke with some tremendous applications, and we're continuing it here in South Carolina. So to make it work, it's necessary to find the right folks, to make sure that they feel they're in an environment where they can be creative, as you discussed earlier today, and to a great deal of extent, I'm actually following their lead. I can facilitate this, but I'm following their lead.
Now, you mentioned last night that actually has turned into you investing in the local Ruby community from a corporate perspective as well.
Well, I hope that my folks, I think they've taken the lead in the Ruby community. I've found that's a tremendously great. We seem to have attracted a focus of developers who are particularly interested in Ruby, and I'm finding that makes my group, that is making for the things we're doing, data-driven web applications, tremendously productive. So we're acting as a magnet for other Ruby developers, and I'm hoping to engender that in our particular group. It means that they contribute and are part of the Ruby community, and I think it's been a very productive thing that we've been able to do. And I'm hoping that group will grow into a more productive contributor to open source in general.
Now, Bob, I know that there's an internal community effort at IBM that you guys have been working on a number of years. I wonder if you could say a few things about that and how you've patterned it.
Sure. Let me go back even a little bit before that. I was in IBM research for 15 years, but in the early 90s, we developed some code, eventually would involve XML. So we'd done this code, it was research, we weren't in a product division. I got this email out of the blue from somebody in our Hursley lab, said that they had heard that we had developed this software. And how much did we want for it so we would give it to them. There's another part of IBM asking how much money they needed to give us to give it the code, which I thought, well, first I thought this would be really great to give us some money. But then it's sort of just the oddness of this struck. And indeed, one of the things that Lou Gerstner said when he came in, so this was an internal memo, but I think the statute of limitations has expired, was you shall not make money for your division by selling your whatever it is you're doing, your wares to other IBM divisions, right? That's not how we count revenue. And then you roll forward a little bit more, and toward the late 90s, there was this famous barbecue, I think, at Sam Palmisano, who's our CEO's house, where he and Irving Wadowski-Berger and people like Dan Fry were trying to decide whether or not IBM would be involved with Linux, this great open source effort. And we, of course, have developed operating systems for 30, 40 years, right? And so here was this challenge to get involved with this open source operating system. And it's funny because the way it's told, I mean, you would think there was this great deep market analysis, and IBM, like many other corporations, we can, you know, kill ourselves with a number of presentations and 50 people on conference calls and things like this. But this came down to a very simple decision, which was fundamentally, why wouldn't we do this, right? We have different hardware platforms, Linux makes a tremendous amount of sense and so forth. And it was really the beginning of this culture within IBM to understand what is the balance between using and getting involved with open source software versus proprietary software, which admittedly we have a very good business still doing. Internally, and I think this is what you were thinking about before, is it's changed the traditional hierarchical view of teams with umpteen levels of management, right? And obviously the higher up you are in management, the smarter you are in terms of technology. Doesn't always work that way. So we developed something we call the Open Source Bazaar internally, where people in different product groups, sometimes very different product groups, can share code. The best code wins. And this, we do this outside. We try to be good citizens in the open source communities in which we're involved. But we also try to do the same thing internally and get the advantages to, as they say, many eyes looking at the code. People making the code more elegant over time, more useful, faster, so forth, in the code we develop for ourselves.
So you've essentially adopted some of those principles internally as well. Guys, any other comments about that, things that you'd want to chime in, or I can go on to the next question?
Well, I'd like to say that the education is also tracking that, but not quite yet.
Yeah.
I think that, that's also one of the big advantages of open source, at least is how it's involved in software development now, is that it's a realization that for programmers who are really worth their salt, it's not cranking out code, it's crafting code. Bob used the word elegant, and that really is a word that developers and programmers use. They look at a piece of code, that is beautiful, that is elegant, it's art. It's an art form. And I think that open source allows that to finally get into, the corporate IT landscape, and a realization that, it really is a lot of untapped potential in developers. And that realization, I think, just helps all the companies to use open source, make that jump.
Isn't there some Twain quote about, sorry I wrote you such a long letter, if I had more time I would have written you a shorter letter? Because it takes more time to do things more elegantly.